The desert wind carried more than dust that morning. It carried whispers of fear through the streets of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, 1883. The small frontier town, built around a struggling copper mine, had seen its share of hardships, but nothing quite like this. Ayanna knelt by the creek that ran behind the settlement, her dark hands moving gracefully as she gathered medicinal herbs. At 19, she possessed a knowledge of desert plants that had been passed down through generations of Apache women. The townspeople had once welcomed her remedies when their own doctors failed them, but that was before the fever. "There she is!" The harsh voice of Mayor Whitman cut through the morning air. "The witch who cursed our children!" Ayanna looked up, water dripping from her fingers, to see a crowd of nearly 30 townspeople approaching. Their faces were twisted with grief and rage, a dangerous combination in a place where justice was often decided by the loudest voice. Mrs. Henderson, the schoolteacher, stepped forward, her usually kind eyes now cold as winter stone. "My little Sarah hasn't spoken a word since you gave her that medicine for her cough. What did you do to her?" "I gave her willow bark tea," Ayanna replied calmly, though her heart was racing. "The same I've given to dozens of others. It helps with fever and—" "Lies!" shouted Tom Bradley, the blacksmith, his massive frame casting a shadow over her slight figure. "My boy Billy was running around healthy as a horse until he drank your poison. Now he can barely lift his head." The crowd pressed closer, a wall of angry faces and pointing fingers. Ayanna slowly stood, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. She had learned long ago that sudden movements could turn fear into violence. "The children have the scarlet fever," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "It's spreading through the town because you live too close together with poor ventilation. My medicine helps with the symptoms, but it cannot cure what comes from—" "Enough!" Mayor Whitman's voice boomed across the creek. "We know what you are, girl. We've seen you talking to the spirits, dancing around fires, casting your heathen spells. You brought this curse upon our town." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Ayanna felt the familiar weight of being caught between two worlds, neither fully accepted by her Apache people, who viewed her association with the white settlers with suspicion, nor trusted by the townspeople, who saw her as a dangerous outsider. "I am a healer," she said, lifting her chin with quiet dignity. "I have helped your families when they needed it most. When Mrs. Patterson's baby was born too early, when old Mr. Fletcher's leg was broken by his horse, when you needed to gain our trust," Mrs. Henderson interrupted, her voice cracking with emotion. "So you could poison our children when we weren't looking." The crowd began to close in, their voices rising in a cacophony of accusations and threats. Ayanna backed toward the creek, but there was nowhere to run. The desert stretched endlessly behind her, and she knew they would chase her down before she could reach the safety of the Apache lands. "Please," she said, raising her hands in a gesture of peace. "Let me examine the children. I can help them. The fever will pass, but they need—" "You'll not touch another child in this town," Mayor Whitman declared. "Men, take her to the old barn. We'll decide what to do with her once we've discussed this properly." Well, strong hands grabbed her arms, and Ayanna found herself being dragged through the town she had served faithfully for 3 years. Windows shuttered as they passed, and the few faces that peered out showed only fear and suspicion. The barn sat at the edge of town, a weathered structure that had once housed the town's first attempt at raising cattle. Now it stood empty, its wooden walls grey with age and neglect. The heavy door creaked open, revealing an interior thick with dust and shadows. "This is where you'll stay until we decide your fate," Mayor Whitman said as they pushed her inside. "And pray to whatever spirits you worship that those children recover, because if they don't—" The door slammed shut with a finality that seemed to echo through her bones. The heavy bar fell into place on the outside, sealing her fate as surely as if they had buried her alive. In the sudden darkness, Ayana sank to her knees on the straw-covered floor. The barn smelled of old hay and abandonment, with thin streams of sunlight filtering through gaps in the wooden planks. She was alone, truly alone, in a way she had never been before. Outside, she could hear the murmur of voices as the townspeople discussed her fate. The words witch, curse, and hanging drifted through the walls like poison on the wind. She closed her eyes and tried to find the strength her grandmother had taught her to draw from the earth itself. But for the first time in her life, the earth felt cold and distant beneath her hands. 3 days passed in the suffocating darkness of the barn. 3 days of stale bread and murky water pushed through a gap in the wall. 3 days of listening to the townspeople's heated debates about her fate, their voices carrying on the desert wind like the cries of hunting vultures. Ayana had tried to remain strong, drawing on the teachings of her grandmother, but the isolation was beginning to take its toll. She found herself talking to the mice that scurried through the straw just to hear a voice, even her own, in the oppressive silence. On the 4th morning, she heard something different. The steady clip-clop of horse hooves, but not the familiar rhythm of the townspeople's mounts. This was a lone rider, moving with purpose, but without hurry. The hoofbeats stopped somewhere near the town center, and Ayana pressed her ear to the wall, straining to hear the voices that followed. There was a new voice among the familiar ones, deeper, quieter, with an accent she couldn't quite place. "Heard you folks got yourselves a problem," the stranger was saying. "Nothing that concerns an outsider," Mayor Whitman replied, his tone defensive. "We're handling our own affairs." "It seems to me you're handling them poorly," the stranger said, and Ayana detected a note of dry humor in his voice. "Word is, you've got a young woman locked up in a barn. That's not exactly the kind of justice most folks would recognize." "She's a witch!" Mrs. Henderson's voice was shrill with hysteria. "She cursed our children. They're dying because of her." There was a long pause, and Ayana held her breath, waiting for the stranger's response. "Ma'am, I've been riding through these parts for nigh on 20 years, he said finally. "I've seen my share of sickness, and I've seen my share of fear. Most times they're not the same thing, but folks have a tendency to confuse the two." "You don't understand," Tom Bradley interjected. "She's one of them Apache. They got their ways, their heathen practices. She's been poisoning our children slowly, gaining our trust, so she could what?" The stranger interrupted, his voice sharp. "Kill the very people who've been feeding her? Destroy the town that's been her home? That doesn't sound like the behavior of someone with much sense, and from what I hear, this girl's been nothing but helpful to your community." Ayana felt a flicker of hope kindle in her chest. Someone was speaking for her, a complete stranger who had no reason to defend her beyond simple human decency. "Who are you anyway?" Mayor Whitman demanded. "What business is this of yours?" "Name's Cole Manning," the stranger replied. "And I make it my business to speak up when I see injustice. That girl in there, she's got a right to face her accusers properly, not be locked away like an animal." "She's dangerous," Mrs. Henderson insisted. "She talks to spirits. She dances around fires. She practices the devil's work." "She practices medicine," Cole Manning said flatly, "and from what I've heard, she's saved more lives in this town than she's taken, which, unless I'm mistaken, would be all of them she's saved and none she's taken." The argument continued for what felt like hours, but Ayana could tell that the stranger, Cole Manning, was making no headway with the frightened townspeople. Their fear had calcified into certainty, and no amount of reason could penetrate that shell. As the sun began to set, painting the barn walls with streaks of orange and red, the voices outside grew quiet. Ayana assumed the stranger had given up and ridden on, like so many others who had passed through Copper Ridge without looking back. But near midnight, she heard footsteps approaching the barn. Soft, careful steps that seemed to avoid the patches of gravel that would announce someone's presence. "Hello in there," a voice called quietly. Cole Manning's voice. Ayanna scrambled to her feet, her heart pounding. "I'm here," she whispered back. "I'm going to get you out of there," he said, and she heard the sound of metal against wood. "Stand back from the door. Wait," she said urgently. "If they catch you, they'll what? Lock me up too?" She could hear the smile in his voice. "Lady, I've been locked up in worse places than this. Besides, I don't much care what they think of me. I'm not planning to stay." The sound of splintering wood filled the air as he worked at the door. Ayanna pressed herself against the far wall, hardly daring to breathe. After what felt like an eternity, the heavy bar gave way with a crack that seemed to echo across the desert. The door swung open, and moonlight spilled into the barn like water. Framed in the doorway stood a man of average height, with sandy hair and weathered features that spoke of years spent under the open sky. His clothes were simple but well made, and there was something in his stance that suggested he was comfortable with danger. "Miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "I'm Cole Manning. I think it's time you got out of here." Ayanna stepped forward into the moonlight, and for the first time in 4 days, she could see clearly. The man before her had kind eyes, but there was steel in them too, the kind that came from making hard decisions in harder times. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you helping me?" Cole Manning looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, perhaps, or understanding. "Because," he said simply, "someone should." Cole Manning led Ayanna away from the barn with the practiced silence of a man who had learned to move unseen through hostile territory. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, waited in the shadows beyond the town's edge, and within minutes they were riding into the desert night. "Where are we going?" Ayanna asked, her voice barely above a whisper as they put distance between themselves and Copper Ridge. "There's a place I know," Cole replied, his eyes scanning the moonlit landscape. "An old line shack about 5 miles north. It's not much, but it's shelter, and it's far enough from town that we can talk without worrying about visitors." They rode in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft thud of hoofbeats on sand and the distant call of a coyote. Ayanna found herself stealing glances at the man who had freed her, trying to understand what would drive a stranger to risk himself for someone he'd never met. Cole Manning was older than she had first thought, probably in his mid-30s, with the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of hard living. His hands on the reins were steady and sure, and she noticed that he kept one hand never far from the gun at his hip. "You're not from around here," she said eventually. "No," he agreed. "I'm not from anywhere, really. I move around a lot." "Why?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then sometimes a man finds it easier to keep moving than to stay in one place long enough for people to figure out who he really is." The line shack turned out to be a small, weathered building that looked like it had been abandoned for years. But when Cole pushed open the door, Ayanna could see that someone had been maintaining it. There were supplies on the shelves, blankets on the single cot, and a small stack of firewood by the stone fireplace. "You've been here before," she observed. "I pass through this way every few months," Cole said, lighting a lantern that hung from a hook on the wall. "The man who owns this place, owned it, I should say. He's been dead for 2 years now, but he used to let me stay here when I needed to." In the lamplight, Ayanna could see Cole's face more clearly. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of laughter, but also deeper grooves that suggested sorrow. His hands, as he worked to start a fire, bore the calluses of hard work and the small scars that came from a lifetime of using them. "Those children," she said suddenly, In the town. Are they really dying? Cole looked up from the kindling he was arranging. Some of them are sick, yes, but not from anything you did. There's scarlet fever running through the settlement. I've seen it before. It's spreading because the families live too close together and they don't understand how sickness moves from person to person. I tried to tell them, Ayana said, sinking onto a wooden stool near the fireplace. But they wouldn't listen. They needed someone to blame, and I was different, Cole finished. I know how that feels. The fire caught, sending warm light dancing across the walls. Cole settled back on his heels, studying her face in the flickering glow. You're not full Apache, he said. It wasn't a question. My mother was Apache, Ayana replied. My father was a Mexican trader who passed through the territory when she was young. She died when I was 12, and I was raised by my grandmother until she passed 3 years ago. And then you came to Copper Ridge. I had nowhere else to go, she said simply. My grandmother had taught me about healing, about the plants that grow in the desert and how to use them. I thought I could help people, build a bridge between the two worlds. Cole nodded slowly. Bridges are dangerous things. They put you right in the middle, where everyone can take shots at you from both sides. Speaking from experience? He was quiet again, poking at the fire with a stick. My mother was Cherokee, he said finally. My father was a white settler who took up land in Oklahoma Territory. I grew up not belonging to either world, just like you. The admission hung between them like a shared secret. Ayana felt something shift in her chest, a recognition, a connection she had never expected to find. Is that why you helped me? She asked. Part of it, Cole said. But mostly because what they were doing was wrong, and I couldn't stand by and watch it happen. They'll come looking for us, Ayana said. When they find the barn empty, they'll want to know where I've gone. Let them come, Cole said, and there was something dangerous in his voice. I've dealt with angry mobs before. I don't want you to get hurt because of me. Cole looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Lady, I've been hurt by better people than the folks in Copper Ridge, and I've been helped by worse people than you. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the desert wind whistled through the gaps in the walls, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of dawn. What happens now? Ayana asked. Now, Cole said, you rest, and tomorrow we figure out how to clear your name and make sure those children get the help they really need. And if we can't, Cole Manning smiled, and it was the first real smile she had seen from him. Then we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. But I have a feeling we're going to surprise a lot of people before this is over. As Ayana settled down on the cot and pulled a blanket over herself, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not just for herself, but for the possibility that two people from different worlds could find common ground in the vast expanse of the American frontier. Outside, the desert held its breath, waiting for the dawn that would bring new challenges and new possibilities. Dawn broke over the desert like a promise, bright, clean, and full of potential. Ayana woke to find Cole already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee in his hands and his eyes fixed on the horizon. They're coming, he said without turning around. 4 riders, maybe 5. They've been tracking us since first light. Ayana sat up, her heart immediately racing. How long do we have? 10 minutes, maybe 15. Cole set down his coffee and began checking his weapons. A rifle, a pistol, and a knife that looked like it had seen considerable use. But I don't think they're here for a fight. How can you be sure? Because Mayor Whitman's with them, and he's not the type to lead a charge himself unless he's pretty sure of the outcome. Cole looked at her then, his expression serious but not afraid. "Are you ready for this?" Ayana took a deep breath, drawing on the strength her grandmother had taught her to find in moments of crisis. "I'm ready." The riders approached the line shack with the kind of caution that suggested they weren't entirely sure what they would find. Mayor Whitman was indeed among them, along with Tom Bradley, Mrs. Henderson, and 2 other men Ayana recognized as townspeople. Cole stepped out of the shack first, his hands empty, but close to his weapons. Ayana followed, standing slightly behind him, but making no attempt to hide. "Morning, gentlemen," Cole said, his voice carrying the kind of casual confidence that made men think twice before starting trouble. "Mrs. Henderson, what brings you all the way out here?" "You know damn well what brings us here," Tom Bradley growled, his hand resting on his gun. "You broke our prisoner out of jail." "I freed an innocent woman from an illegal imprisonment," Cole corrected. "There's a difference." "Ah, she's a witch," Mrs. Henderson cried. "She cursed our children." "No," said a new voice, and everyone turned to see a young woman riding up from the direction of town. It was Sarah Henderson, the schoolteacher's daughter who had supposedly been struck mute by Ayana's curse. "Sarah," Mrs. Henderson gasped, "what are you doing here? You should be in bed." "I'm fine, Mama," Sarah said, dismounting from her horse with the easy grace of someone who had recovered from illness. "And I came to tell the truth." The girl walked over to stand beside Ayana, her young face set with determination. "Miss Ayana didn't curse me. I got sick the same way all the other children did, from the fever that's been going around. Her medicine made me feel better, not worse." "But you stopped talking," her mother said, confusion and hope warring in her voice. "I stopped talking because I was scared," Sarah replied. "Scared of what people were saying about Miss Ayana, scared of what might happen to her because she tried to help us. So I pretended to be sicker than I was, thinking it might help somehow." A murmur ran through the group of riders. Tom Bradley looked uncertain for the first time since Ayana had known him. "What about my boy Billy?" he asked. "He's still sick." "Billy's got the scarlet fever," Ayana said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation had begun. "Same as at least 6 other children in town. It's not a curse. It's a disease that spreads when people live too close together without proper sanitation." "How do you know that?" Mayor Whitman demanded. "Because I've seen it before," Cole said. "In other towns, other settlements. It's not uncommon, and it's not supernatural. It's just sickness." "Then why are our children dying, Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice breaking. "Because you're not treating them properly," Ayana said gently. "You're keeping them in stuffy rooms, giving them heavy food their stomachs can't handle, and not letting them get the fresh air and clean water they need to recover. You're saying we're making them worse?" Tom Bradley's voice was incredulous. "I'm saying you're trying to help them the only way you know how," Ayana replied. "But there are better ways, if you'll let me show you." The standoff stretched out like a taut rope, ready to snap at any moment. Then Sarah Henderson spoke up again. "Let her help," the girl said. "Please, Billy Bradley is my friend, and so are the other children. If Miss Ayana knows how to make them better, why wouldn't we want her to try?" "Because she's—" Mayor Whitman began, then stopped himself. In the clear light of morning, with Sarah Henderson standing healthy and whole beside the woman she was supposed to have cursed, the accusation seemed less certain. "She's what?" Cole asked quietly. "Different? Apache? Someone who doesn't look like you or worship the same way you do? Since when did any of that make a person evil?" "We were scared," Mrs. Henderson said finally, her voice small. "When the children got sick, we were so scared, and we needed someone to blame." Fear makes people do terrible things," Cole said. "I've seen it happen before, but courage can make them do better things." Mayor Whitman cleared his throat. If you were to come back to town and help with the children, would you be willing to forget about what happened? About the barn and all? Ayana looked at Cole, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "I'll come back," she said, "but not to forget. To forgive. There's a difference." "And I'll be staying around for a while," Cole added, "just to make sure everyone remembers the difference between justice and fear." The ride back to Copper Ridge was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one that had preceded the confrontation. It was the quiet of people thinking, of minds slowly opening to possibilities they had rejected in their fear. When they reached the town, Ayana went immediately to work. She examined the sick children, prepared proper medicines, and gave their families detailed instructions on care and treatment. Cole stayed close, not because he didn't trust the townspeople, but because he understood that change took time and fear died hard. Within a week, the fever had broken in all but one of the children, and even that boy was clearly improving. The townspeople began to look at Ayana with new eyes, not as a dangerous outsider, but as a skilled healer who had risked her own safety to help their children. "Will you stay?" Mrs. Henderson asked her one evening as they sat by the bedside of her recovering daughter. "For now," Ayana replied, "as long as I'm needed and welcome." "And your friend? The cowboy?" Ayana glanced through the window at Cole, who was talking with some of the men near the general store. "I don't know. He's not the type to put down roots." But as the days passed, Cole showed no signs of moving on. He made himself useful around the town, helping with repairs and offering his knowledge of the wider territory. More importantly, he and Ayana began to spend their evenings together, talking about everything and nothing as they walked through the desert under the stars. "Are you planning to stay?" she asked him one night as they sat by the creek where she had first been accused. "I'm thinking about it," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I'm thinking about stopping." "Why?" He looked at her then, his eyes soft in the moonlight. "Because I found something worth staying for." The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative, like two people who had been alone for so long they had forgotten how to be together. But it was also full of promise. The promise of two damaged souls finding healing in each other, of two outsiders creating their own place in the world. In the distance, the lights of Copper Ridge twinkled like earthbound stars, and the desert wind carried the scent of rain and new beginnings. It would not be an easy path they were choosing, but it was their path, and they would walk it together. The Apache girl and the lone cowboy had found something neither had been looking for, something they didn't even know they were missing. It wasn't shelter from the sun or safety from the dangers of the open land. It wasn't comfort in the traditional sense, nor the kind of companionship that filled silence with idle words. What they found was a home, not bound to walls or rooted in geography, but alive in the quiet, steady presence of each other. In a land where the wind carried stories of loss and betrayal more often than tales of kindness, where acceptance was something that had to be earned through resilience and time, and where trust was not given but forged like iron, they built something rare, something defiant, a bond that did not ignore their differences but embraced them, a love that was not born out of need or desperation, but out of mutual recognition, two spirits scarred and wandering who had finally stopped running. Through shared hardships and quiet connection, the Apache girl and the cowboy grew to understand and heal one another. Despite past wounds and mistrust, they created a bond so deep that it became their home, not a place, but a lasting sense of belonging they would never choose to leave.